Sign the line, Richard. He is not waking up, and the land does not care who owns it. That was my mother's voice, flat and unhurried, drifting across the pine floorboards of my grandfather's lake house on Beaver Lake. I was standing just outside the screen door, the humid Arkansas night air heavy on my neck. My father did not answer immediately. I heard the distinct rustle of heavy bond paper sliding across the old oak table, followed by the dry click of a pen being uncapped. My mother spoke again, her tone dropping into that familiar, efficient register she used when balancing the ledger. Hazel is a database administrator. She deals in digital assets, not ancestral acreage. She does not need 400 feet of shoreline on the water, but our credit line does. My fingers tightened against the wooden frame of the door. I did not move. I did not make a sound. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories, where we look at the quiet, unyielding mechanics of family boundaries and the exact moment someone refuses to be deleted from their own life. If you have ever had your legacy treated like a transaction by the people who were supposed to protect it, drop your age in the comments below and hit subscribe. Let us get into it. That conversation inside the cabin happened on a rainy Tuesday evening, but the system failure that caused it had been rendering in the background for over a decade. My name is Hazel Alexandra Brooks. I am 28 years old, and I manage data integrity for an enterprise logistics firm in Fayetteville. My job is to locate anomalies, track unauthorized access, and ensure that what is recorded in the core registry matches reality perfectly. I spent my youth learning how to monitor systems because the human architecture in my own home was completely unreliable. My younger brother Garrett was the primary investment. My parents Richard and Evelyn Brooks viewed him as the continuation of the family name, financing his life through a series of quiet liquidations. They bought him a pristine truck for his 16th birthday, funded a debt-free degree at the university, and overlooked every overdraft fee he generated. Meanwhile, I was the baseline expense, the line item they optimized by reducing my allocation. I paid for my own information systems degree by working the midnight shift at a data center watching cooling fans spin while my classmates slept. The only entity in this Brooks line that operated on absolute integrity was my grandfather Silas. He built the lake house on Beaver Lake in 1965 after returning from Korea, clearing the timber with his own hands and anchoring the foundation into the limestone shelf. For Silas, that land was a sacred repository of Ozark heritage, a physical manifestation of a promise that the family would always have a place to anchor. He recognized the analytical nature of my mind early on. When I was 12, he handed me a heavy brass boat cleat from his first dock and told me that real security is built on verified foundations, not shifting promises. 2 years before his passing, Silas executed a clear ironclad will that bypassed my father, entirely naming me as the sole beneficiary of the lake house. My parents treated the reading of that document like a system breach. They stopped calling me on weekends. They excluded me from the holiday planning registry. They assumed that because I remained quiet, I was compliant. They did not understand that a database administrator does not scream when she detects a corrupted entry. She gathers the logs, verifies the timestamps, and waits for the exact moment to deploy the patch. The architecture of a family home can tell you exactly where you stand on the balance sheet long before you learn how to read a financial statement. In the Brooks household, the numbers never added up in my favor. My brother Garrett received his first car when he turned 16, a spotless silver pickup truck with leather seats and a premium sound system that rattled the windows of our suburban garage. My parents presented it to him in the driveway with a giant red bow and a round of applause capturing the entire event on their social media profiles to demonstrate their success to the neighborhood. When my 16th birthday arrived a year and a half later, my mother handed me a plastic folder containing a public transit map and a used laptop with a failing battery, suggesting that a resourceful young woman would find her own way to the library. I took the laptop, repaired the corrupted operating system myself, and used it to write the code that would eventually secure my employment. I did not shed a tear or demand a matching celebration. I simply recorded the discrepancy in my mind, understanding that my presence in their lives was viewed as an administrative expense rather than an asset. This domestic economy became even more pronounced when the time came for higher education. Garrett expressed a vague interest in business management, which my father interpreted as a sign of executive potential. They immediately paid his full tuition at the University of Arkansas, covering his housing in a luxury off-campus apartment complex and providing him with a monthly allowance that allowed him to spend his weekends golfing and hosting parties. For my education, my father sat me down at the kitchen table with a single sheet of paper from a local community college brochure. He explained that since I was so naturally independent, it would be a valuable character-building exercise for me to finance my own degree through student loans and employment. I accepted his terms without an argument. I transferred to the university data science program on a merit scholarship, working the graveyard shift at a secure data repository on the edge of town. My schedule consisted of monitoring server temperatures from midnight until 8 in the morning, followed by an advanced calculus lecture at 9. I learned to sleep in 40-minute increments on the public transit bus, my jacket folded against the cold glass window. My parents did not view my graduation or my subsequent corporate position as an achievement to be celebrated. Instead, they treated my self-reliance as a convenient justification for my permanent erasure from the family ledger. During Thanksgiving dinners and holiday gatherings, Aunt Renee would openly discuss the future distribution of family heirlooms, allocating grandfather's antique silver and my grandmother's jewelry to Garrett's future children, while completely bypassing my empty seat at the table. When I pointed out that a database required equal distribution of indexes to prevent a system crash, my mother laughed a sharp, brittle sound that clipped the edges of her words. She told the table that Hazel was far too practical to care about sentimental trinkets, suggesting that my corporate salary meant I did not require an inheritance. They mistook my silence for absence. They assumed that because I did not participate in their emotional theater, I was unaware of the slow liquidation occurring around me. The only physical space where my name held absolute unassailable weight was the cedar log house on the northern shoreline of Beaver Lake. Grandfather Silas built that structure with a level of precision that mirrored my own professional standards. He chose thick, hand-hewn logs that resisted the damp Arkansas winters, anchoring the support beams directly into the solid limestone shelf that bordered the water. While my father viewed the land as a speculative asset to be leveraged for country club status, Silas treated the property as an anchor for the family identity. During the long summer weeks I spent with him while my parents took Garrett on tropical vacations, he taught me how to read the topography of the lakebed and how to maintain the water lines. He watched me organize his old tackle boxes by weight and size, a small smile appearing beneath his silver mustache. He told me that a system without order is just a collection of noise, and that I possessed the rare ability to find the signal in the dark. 2 years before his heart finally failed, Silas walked into the county clerk's office with his attorney and executed a simple ironclad last will and testament. He did not consult my father, and he did not seek permission from my mother. He left the entire lake estate, including the 400 feet of pristine shoreline and the vintage timber dock, solely to me. When the document was read in the probate attorney's office after the funeral, my father's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The standard mask of Southern politeness vanished, replaced by a dark, congested expression as he realized his own father had completely bypassed him in favor of a 26-year-old database administrator. My mother refused to touch the copy of the document, declaring that Silas had clearly lost his mental acuity in his final days. They left the office without speaking to me, embarking on a 5-month campaign of absolute silence that felt less like a family dispute and more like a corporate lockout. I did not let their hostility disrupt my routine. I quietly assumed the maintenance costs of the lake house, updating the security infrastructure and ensuring the property taxes were paid directly from my personal checking account. I believed the legal boundary my grandfather had established would be sufficient to keep their desperation at bay. What I did not account for was the catastrophic failure of my father's commercial real estate developments in Bentonville. Richard Brooks had spent 3 years borrowing against his existing assets to fund a high-density luxury townhome project that stalled during the municipal zoning phase. By the time the bank issued a formal default notice on his primary residence, his debt had reached a level that standard financing could no longer cover. He needed a massive immediate injection of cash to prevent a public bankruptcy that would destroy his reputation at the country club. Instead of approaching me to negotiate an honest arrangement, my parents decided to treat my grandfather's sacred legacy as a temporary line item they could simply delete from the county database. They knew that a standard legal challenge to the will would take years to resolve in the probate court time my father's creditors would not allow. They required a swift, invisible transaction that would present the buyer with a clean title before I ever realized the system had been compromised. My father retained a corporate electronic signature account that we had jointly used years prior to clear my undergraduate vehicle loan, an account he had never formally closed or stripped of its administrative privileges. On a rainy Monday morning, while I was occupied with a critical database migration at my firm, a new listing appeared on the regional multiple listing service. The cedar cabin on Beaver Lake was offered for sale at a price well below market value under the condition of an expedited cash closing within 15 days. The listing did not feature my father's name. It featured a digital reproduction of my own signature, authorized through the compromised corporate portal. They had decided to sell my inheritance by pretending I was the person driving the transaction. As I sat at my desk, watching the automated property registry alert flash crimson against my secondary monitor, I realized that the conflict had transitioned from a petty family exclusion into an international title fraud. They thought they had successfully executed a silent deletion, entirely unaware that every digital footprint leaves a permanent log in the registry. The vibration of my phone against the mahogany laminate of my workstation broke the steady rhythm of my database diagnostic script. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the name flashing on the caller identification array belonged to Evelyn Brooks. My mother had not initiated direct contact with me since the frosty reading of my grandfather Silas's estate administration documents 5 months ago. When I accepted the transmission, her voice did not possess the tense adversarial edge that had characterized our last interaction. Instead, it was saturated with a fluid, performative warmth that I had not witnessed since she was orchestrating fundraising galas for the local botanical society. She called me honey twice within the span of 10 seconds, a rhetorical deployment that instantly signaled a high-priority system anomaly to my analytical mind. She explained that she and my father were organizing a spontaneous quiet gathering this coming Friday morning at 10 o'clock at the Dixon Street Bistro in Fayetteville. She described it as a gentle, long-overdue family meeting intended to finalize some residual minor bureaucratic paperwork left behind by my grandfather's passing. Her words were enveloped in that specific honeyed Southern cadence that families in our social tier use to disguise a predatory financial maneuver. She told me it was simply time to sweep away the loose historical details so that the entire family unit could move forward into the next season cleanly and without lingering obligations. I sat unmoving in my ergonomic mesh chair, my left hand dropping to the corner of my desk where the heavy brass boat cleat rested. That piece of weathered metal was the final physical item Silas had placed in my palm before his admission to the cardiac care ward. He had salvaged it from his original cedar dock when the Army Corps of Engineers adjusted the water level of Beaver Lake in the late 80s. He told me then that when a structure is threatened by external currents, you do not abandon the anchoring point. You fortify the foundation. Feeling the cold weight of that brass against my fingers, I could read the underlying intent of my mother's telephonic invitation with the absolute clarity of an engineer auditing a malicious software script. This proposed breakfast meeting was not an olive branch or an attempt at domestic reconciliation. It was a classic diversion protocol. While my mother was painting a picture of an intimate family breakfast over poached eggs and coffee, my secondary monitor was actively displaying the hidden metadata logs of the Washington County Property Registry. The expedited cash transaction with the commercial hospitality group from Dallas was formally scheduled for processing at exactly 10:15 on that identical Friday morning 3 blocks away at the headquarters of Tallgrass Title and Escrow. My parents had calculated every parameter of this interaction with the precision of a hostile corporate takeover. They required my physical presence inside a public restaurant, anchored to a table and bound by the invisible rules of polite public decorum at the precise moment their forged documentation was being executed across town. They wanted me to play the role of the quiet, unquestioning database technician, while they stripped the legal foundation from my heritage. The tactical error they committed was assuming that because I rarely vocalized my dissent, my perception was limited. My father had spent 30 years relying on my compliance because it made the domestic accounting easier for everyone involved. He was a man who measured family loyalty by how little trouble a person caused his personal real estate portfolio. When I was 19 and my car transmission failed during finals week, he suggested I sell my plasma to cover the mechanic's invoice rather than disrupt his country club liquidity allocation. I had accepted that reality because it taught me to build my own firewalls. Now they believed the same passive compliance would ensure the success of their fraudulent property transfer. Instead of declining the invitation or initiating a premature legal confrontation that would allow them to alter their trajectory, I maintained a perfectly level vocal tone. I told my mother that the Dixon Street Bistro sounded like an appropriate venue and that I would adjust my corporate schedule to accommodate their Friday morning timeline. Her sigh of relief over the telephone line was audible, followed by a swift, triumphant confirmation that she would notify Aunt Renee and Garrett of my cooperative stance. After the connection terminated, the silence of my apartment felt heavy with the impending weight of a structural collision. The immediate challenge that now presented itself was the short temporal window remaining on the administrative calendar. I had less than 72 hours to intercept a multi-million-dollar land theft without alerting the perpetrators that their digital footprints had been discovered. If I contacted the Fayetteville Police Department or filed a standard fraud report through the Regional Real Estate Board, the administrative machinery would move with the agonizing slowness of a legacy government mainframe. The title company would put a temporary administrative hold on the closing file. My father's corporate attorneys would immediately discover the source of the data leak, and the ensuing litigation would tie up my grandfather's land in probate restrictions for the next decade. My parents had already demonstrated their willingness to manufacture my signature through a compromised electronic identity portal. There was no telling what secondary fraudulent documentation they might introduce if they were forced into a defensive posture. I needed a countermeasure that would operate underneath their operational radar, a legal patch that would allow them to proceed with absolute confidence right up to the final second of the transaction before executing a definitive terminal block. I needed to access the primary physical archives of my grandfather's legal transactions, records that existed outside the vulnerable cloud networks my father had manipulated. I reached for my keys in my work satchel, bypassing my corporate tasks for the afternoon. I knew that the true validation of a property asset did not always reside in the current digital index of the county courthouse, especially when the entities managing that index were susceptible to identity manipulation. I needed to contact the old network that Silas had trusted before his health collapsed. I needed to look at the physical records held by his lifelong legal advisor, Marcus Vance, a man who still utilized physical ledgers and manual filing cabinets in his Hot Springs office. As I backed my sedan out of the Fayetteville parking garage and pointed it toward the highway, the first drops of a summer storm began to streak the windshield. I monitored the digital clock on the dashboard, watching the minutes decrement toward the Friday morning deadline. My parents believed they were guiding an unsuspecting pawn toward a quiet table on Dixon Street, completely oblivious to the fact that the person they were trying to isolate had already initiated a comprehensive forensic audit of their entire financial survival plan. The layer of simple family neglect had dissolved entirely, revealing a complex web of industrial title fraud that threatened to destroy the only sanctuary I had left. I adjusted my steering wheel, my mind operating with the quiet, chilling efficiency of a server cluster preparing for a system-wide override. The drive back from the county archives through the fading evening light did nothing to quiet the analytical gears turning in my mind. On Wednesday morning, instead of returning to my corporate office or initiating a premature confrontation with my mother, I redirected my vehicle to the Washington County Courthouse in downtown Fayetteville. The stone steps were damp from the lingering summer humidity, a heavy contrast to the chilled, sterile atmosphere of the Land Records Division inside. I approached the records counter with my corporate badge displayed alongside my state identification, requesting a standard review of the active escrow files for the Beaver Lake Quadrant, under the pretext of a routine technical title verification. The clerk, a tired woman who recognized my last name from my grandfather Silas's historic surveyor filings, generated the requested documents on her terminal without hesitation. She swiveled the monitor toward me, allowing me to view the digitized payload of the pending transaction. When the scanned images of the purchase contract populated the screen, my gaze instantly locked onto the primary authorization line. The letters spelled out my full legal name, rendered in a smooth, elegant looping script that would easily deceive a casual observer. It possessed the exact slant of my cursive and the precise spacing of my initials. However, as someone who spent 40 hours a week auditing individual data entries for structural anomalies, I noticed the failure of the script immediately. It lacked the distinct, sharp, abrupt termination I always utilized when concluding a formal signature on a legal instrument. My grandfather had taught me to slash the final stroke of my name to prevent unauthorized additions to my field notes, a physical habit that had transferred directly into my adult life. This rendering was entirely fluid, a flawless aesthetic imitation that lacked human authenticity. I traced the electronic validation data printed along the bottom margin of the page. The system metadata revealed that the authorization had been generated through a legacy administrative portal linked to a defunct family banking account. 6 years ago, when I was an undergraduate student purchasing a modest sedan to commute between my server room shifts and the university campus, my father had insisted on co-signing the loan instrument through his commercial credit line. He had established a shared electronic signature profile, retaining master administrative privileges over the digital credentials. I had removed my active profiles from that portal years prior, but Richard Brooks had never deactivated the primary corporate node. He had simply accessed the dormant shell company account, updated the verification parameters to mimic my current details, and applied the forged credential to a multi-million-dollar real estate contract. The depth of the betrayal became even more severe when my eyes scanned the corporate identity of the purchasing entity. The buyer was a high-density commercial hospitality syndicate based out of Dallas, Texas, operating under a Shell Limited Liability Company. They were offering $2.4 million in cash for the pristine 400-foot shoreline property. I skipped past the financial summary and read the attached development addendum. The Texas syndicate intended to demolish the hand-built cedar cabin within 30 days of taking possession, clearing the ancient oak trees that Silas had spent his lifetime protecting to install a concrete retaining wall. The protected natural cove would be converted into a commercial high-density motorized rental dock featuring 36 individual slips for jet skis and commercial pontoon boats. They were not merely siphoning the equity my grandfather had secured for my future. They were actively preparing to dismantle the ecological and historical sanctuary that defined our entire family heritage in the region. Silas had spent 40 years serving on the local water conservation board, fighting the rapid commercial encroachment that threatened to turn the clear waters of Beaver Lake into a chaotic playground for out-of-state developers. My parents were handing the keys to the highest bidder, completely indifferent to the destruction of his life's work. The passive friction of parental neglect had crossed an irreversible boundary, evolving into an intentional felony title fraud that carried severe federal prison consequences. I reached into my satchel, pulled out an encrypted external drive, and plugged it into the courthouse terminal port, utilizing my authorized administrative access to mirror the entire transaction log, the IP routing histories, and the forged electronic signature certificates. The clerk remained occupied with a stack of paper deeds at the far end of the counter, oblivious to the fact that I was downloading the complete forensic evidence package required to dismantle my father's entire financial existence. My face remained completely flat, my expression reflecting nothing but the cold blue glow of the monitor screen. I felt no sudden urge to cry, no burning desire to drive to my parents' residence to demand an explanation, and no impulse to notify the fraud division of the state police. If I intervened at this precise moment, my father would simply claim an administrative misunderstanding, withdraw the fraudulent listing and retreat into the shadows to formulate an alternative method to liquidate the property. His corporate attorneys would shield him behind layers of plausible deniability, leaving me with a compromised title and an ongoing domestic war that would drain my energy for the next decade. To secure a permanent resolution, I needed to let the system execute the full payload. I would allow them to walk right up to the precipice of the Friday morning closing, confident that their quiet deception had succeeded perfectly. I would let them formally present the forged documentation to the closing agents, finalizing the fraudulent transfer of ownership before I deployed the terminal countermeasure. I safely disconnected my encrypted drive from the terminal, thanked the clerk for her assistance, and stepped back out into the bright afternoon light of the courthouse square. The town was buzzing with the casual energy of a summer afternoon, completely disconnected from the quiet legal war I was preparing to wage. As I walked toward my vehicle, a new notification populated my personal device. It was a group message from Aunt Renee containing a digital image of the reservation confirmation at the Dixon Street Bistro for Friday morning, accompanied by a casual reminder for everyone to dress appropriately for a celebratory family milestone. I stored the device in my pocket without sending a response. The trap my parents had constructed for me was fully operational, but they had built it on an architecture they did not understand. They believed they were dealing with the compliant girl who had quietly accepted their crumbs for 28 years. They did not realize that they had handed a master database administrator the exact forensic key required to execute a total system wipe. The forensic evidence package resting inside my work satchel was technically flawless, yet it immediately presented a critical operational vulnerability. As I navigated my vehicle back through the evening traffic, the realities of the traditional legal system began to clash with my computational training. If I attempted to deploy this evidence through standard corporate channels or initiated an immediate emergency injunction through a family law practice, I would be playing directly into my father's hands. Richard Brooks had spent his entire career navigating the bureaucratic delays of commercial real estate litigation. His retained counsel knew precisely how to leverage procedural motions, jurisdictional disputes, and evidentiary hearings to tie up a contested title in the probate court system for an indefinite duration. They would drain my modest savings account through a war of attrition, while the lake house sat neglected, caught in a permanent administrative limbo. I needed a definitive structural override that bypassed their digital territory entirely. I required an ally who operated outside the vulnerable cloud-based networks my father had spent the last 2 weeks exploiting. Pulling my sedan into a quiet overlook near the interstate, I retrieved my personal device and placed a direct call to a number I had memorized from my grandfather's old address log. Marcus Vance was an elder law practitioner based out of Hot Springs, a man who had stood beside Silas Brooks through 40 years of regional development battles and personal milestones. Marcus was a legal traditionalist of the old Southern school, an individual who notoriously refused to store his primary client archives on remote servers, preferring instead the unassailable security of physical leather-bound ledgers and heavy steel filing cabinets behind a locked oak door. When the line connected, the deep, measured cadence of the veteran attorney filled the interior of my car. I did not waste time with emotional preambles. I laid out the parameters of the situation with the clinical precision of a system diagnostic report. I detailed the pending Friday morning closing at Tallgrass Title and Escrow, the $2.4 million cash consideration from the Dallas Hospitality Syndicate, and the precise methodology my father had used to resurrect a dormant electronic signature credential from my undergraduate vehicle loan. I explained that within less than 48 hours, a fraudulent transfer of ownership would be permanently committed to the county registry unless we intervened with an absolute terminal block. Marcus Vance listened to the technical breakdown without interrupting a single time, the only sound on his end being the distant rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in his office study. When I concluded my summary, the lawyer did not react with the shock or righteous indignation I might have expected from a standard family representative. Instead, a low, dry laugh rumbled over the secure telephonic connection, a sound carrying the quiet satisfaction of a grandmaster watching an opponent step directly into a long-range trap. Marcus told me that my grandfather had anticipated this exact scenario with remarkable clarity long before his health collapsed. He explained that Silas knew precisely what kind of man his son Richard had become under the pressure of his commercial debts. Silas had observed my father's predatory instincts during the final years of my grandmother's illness, noting how Richard viewed every piece of family heritage as an object to be liquidated for immediate country club status. Marcus revealed that my grandfather had not simply relied on a standard last will and testament to secure my future. He understood that a piece of paper can be challenged, hidden, or litigated out of existence by desperate people. He had looked at my career in information security and decided to build a secondary physical firewall around the Beaver Lake property, executing a covert legal countermeasure during the final week of his life, when my parents assumed he was too weak to monitor his affairs. The attorney instructed me to maintain my absolute silence and to attend the Friday morning gathering at the Dixon Street Bistro exactly as my mother had requested. He explicitly told me to bring nothing but my professional composure to the restaurant table, leaving the forensic files and the digital evidence drives completely hidden inside my bag. Marcus stated that the trap Silas had constructed required my parents to be entirely confident in their victory, allowing them to formally present their fraudulent documentation to the escrow agents before the system delivered its definitive checkmate. He told me that he would personally handle the deployment of the secondary instrument, ensuring it intersected with the closing process at the exact microsecond required to lock down the title permanently. As the conversation concluded and the line went silent, the immediate panic that had threatened to disrupt my analytical focus dissipated entirely, replaced by a cold, operational certainty. The dynamic of the conflict had shifted. It was no longer a defensive struggle by an isolated daughter trying to protect her inheritance from a predatory family unit. It had transformed into a synchronized, two-pronged counteroffensive orchestrated by an expert data architect and the legal ghost of the patriarch who had built the sanctuary in the first place. My parents believed they were engineering a quiet erasure, entirely unaware that the system they were trying to infiltrate had been retrofitted with an unassailable defensive protocol designed specifically to trap them in the act of transaction. I restarted my engine and merged back onto the dark highway, the digital dashboard projecting a steady green glow across my hands. A new layer of tension was already forming in the dark. To ensure the success of Marcus's plan, I would have to endure the next 36 hours without giving a single indication that the network had been compromised. I would have to respond to my mother's transactional text messages with appropriate deference, listen to my brother Garrett's boastful social media updates about his upcoming commercial ventures, and prepare myself to sit across from Aunt Renee while she performed her traditional routine of passive-aggressive exclusion. I was entering a room where I would be viewed as the sacrificial lamb, and my survival depended entirely on my ability to play that role flawlessly until the precise moment the trap snapped shut. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind clearing the unnecessary emotional threads to leave only the core logic of the countermeasure. I was ready for the Friday morning deployment. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, humid stillness that characterizes an Arkansas summer, a thick atmosphere that seemed to trap the morning heat against the pavement of Fayetteville. The Dixon Street Bistro was mostly vacant at that early hour, its dim interior smelling faintly of roasted coffee beans and floor wax. I stepped through the heavy glass door, the sudden drop in temperature from the climate control system striking my face. My eyes immediately adjusted to the low lighting tracking across the brick walls to locate the corner booth near the back of the establishment. There sat Richard and Evelyn Brooks, positioned like executives at the head of a conference table. Flanking my father was Aunt Renee, his older sister, and the undisputed social architect of our family dynamic. Renee was an individual who had turned passive-aggressive manipulation into a regional art form, occupying her days with country club committees and the systemic sorting of our relatives into tiers of social relevance. Today she was adorned in expensive, pristine cream linen that resisted the outdoor humidity, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient pattern against a monogrammed brown leather portfolio. As I approached the table, my parents rose in unison, their movements exhibiting the fluid, synchronized precision of a thoroughly rehearsed stage production. The smiles they offered were wide and empty, failing to reach their eyes, serving merely as an aesthetic mask to establish an illusion of domestic unity for the benefit of the restaurant staff. "There she is," Aunt Renee chimed, her voice carrying a bright theatrical pitch that resonated across the empty dining area. She stepped forward to press a cold, heavily powder-scented cheek against mine, a physical gesture devoid of genuine warmth. She gripped my shoulders lightly, stepping back to audit my appearance with a swift, critical sweep of her eyes before continuing her performance. "Our practical, quiet girl," she said, her tone carrying that patronizing layer of regional condescension. "We were just telling your mother how wonderful it is that you are always so incredibly cooperative when the family needs to make these difficult structural choices." I did not offer a vocal correction to her narrative. I slid into the remaining open chair, positioning my small leather work bag precisely beside my water glass on the crisp white tablecloth. The physical layout of the table was entirely deliberate, structured with the intent to execute a specific transaction before any casual conversation could disrupt the momentum. My father had placed a single sheet of heavy bond paper face down next to my bread plate, its white backing contrasting sharply with the darker wood of the table edge. Resting precisely over the center of the unexposed document was a heavy silver executive pen angled toward my right hand like a religious offering. The menus remained closed and stacked at the far edge of the setting, and the server had not yet been permitted to approach our section. My parents had engineered the timeline to ensure that the signature on this mysterious waiver was secured before the kitchen could even fire the first round of breakfast items, guaranteeing my legal compliance before I had the opportunity to realize the structural trap had been sprung. The minor tension of Aunt Renee's superficial greeting instantly dissolved, giving way to a much larger, more predatory confrontation as my father leaned forward across the table. Richard Brooks adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, his eyes tracking the movement of his own hands rather than meeting my direct gaze. He cleared his throat, a dry, nervous sound that betrayed the high financial stakes riding on the next 5 minutes of our interaction. The script they had prepared for me was simple, relying heavily on my historical pattern of avoiding public scenes to force my hand. He began to speak in a low, conspiratorial murmur, explaining that the family had reached a critical operational junction regarding grandfather Silas's estate, and that they required my immediate administrative clearance to protect the broader family assets from an impending tax assessment. I looked at the face-down paper, then at my mother, who was watching my expression with a sharp, bird-like intensity. Evelyn Brooks had spent 28 years managing the social ledger of our household, ensuring that any deviation from her established plan was met with swift emotional liquidation. She picked up her water glass, her movements fluid and controlled, yet I could see the faint tremor in her polished knuckles. They were entirely convinced that their diversion had succeeded, believing that I had arrived at this restaurant completely oblivious to the fact that their commercial real estate debts were collapsing around them. They thought I was still the compliant daughter who would sign whatever document was placed before her simply to maintain the fragile peace of a family breakfast. As my father's hand reached out to turn the document over, revealing the legal language hidden on the other side, a new wave of structural conflict surfaced. I could see the bold lettering at the top of the page reading, "Retroactive Title Ratification" and Waiver of Claims. It was the exact instrument I had anticipated after my forensic audit at the county courthouse on Wednesday. If I picked up that silver pen and applied my name to the line, I would legally validate the forged electronic signature my father had generated using the old vehicle loan portal, stripping myself of my grandfather's sacred legacy while immunizing my parents from felony prosecution. The dramatic tension in the corner booth began to escalate the silence between my father's explanation and my physical response, stretching out until it became a heavy, palpable force in the room. Aunt Renee stopped her rhythmic tapping, her hand resting flat on her portfolio as she waited for me to comply with the family directive. They had calculated the timing to the exact minute, knowing that 3 blocks away, the escrow officers at Tallgrass Title were already preparing the final wire transfers for the Texas syndicate. They believed they were completing a seamless deletion of my rights, completely unaware that the database administrator sitting across from them had spent the last 48 hours configuring a total system override. I reached out my right hand, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the silver pen, but instead of lifting it, I simply rotated it 90 degrees, aligning it parallel to the edge of the table. The look of satisfaction on my mother's face instantly froze, her eyes narrowing as she realized the script was no longer running according to her parameters. My father took a shallow breath, his hand remaining on the edge of the paper, as if he could physically force its acceptance through proximity alone. He leaned a fraction closer, the starched collar of his dress shirt pressing against his jawline as he attempted to project an aura of calm, paternal authority. "It is just a standard quitclaim acknowledgement. Hazel," he explained, his voice dropping into that smooth, clinical cadence he usually reserved for terminating subcontractors on his failing development sites. He claimed the underwriting company required this secondary signature simply to clear up a minor technical title discrepancy for the regional title insurer. He looked past my shoulder toward the empty bar area, continuing his verbal presentation by outlining the supposedly heavy financial burdens he and my mother had absorbed over the years to keep the lakefront estate functioning. He stated that since I was now firmly established in my corporate database career with a predictable income stream, it simply did not make structural sense for a single woman to carry such a massive personal liability on her personal balance sheet. I picked up the heavy bond paper, the crisp texture rustling quietly in the silent corner booth. I did not require an advanced legal degree to parse the payload of the document. My daily professional existence was defined by reading the exact structural parameters of data inputs, and this instrument was a poorly disguised Trojan horse. It was not a routine title clearance or a simple administrative waiver. It was a comprehensive, retroactive ratification agreement drafted by a commercial specialist. If I applied my name to that designated line, I would be providing explicit, legally binding validation for the fraudulent electronic signature my father had generated on the contract with the Dallas Hospitality Corporation on Monday morning. By signing this document, I would instantly immunize Richard and Evelyn Brooks from federal identity theft and felony title fraud prosecution while simultaneously surrendering my entire ancestral inheritance for $0. As I scanned the dense paragraphs of boilerplate text, the psychological architecture of my childhood became entirely visible. My father was attempting to weaponize 28 years of domestic conditioning against me in a single transaction. Throughout my formative years, the unwritten rule of our household was that my value was directly tied to how little space I occupied and how few resources I requested. I was expected to be the easy child, the inexpensive daughter who quietly accepted the hand-me-down electronics and funded her own education so that the primary family capital could be redirected toward my brother Garrett's lifestyle. They had spent my entire life teaching me that compliance was the only currency that would guarantee my continued inclusion at their table. Now facing a catastrophic financial default on his commercial real estate loans, my father was trying to use that exact emotional leverage to force me into financial suicide for his benefit. I turned the page over, resting it flat against the linen cloth, with the blank side facing upward. I looked directly across the small space into my father's face. The confident executive mask he had worn when walking into the bistro was beginning to dissolve, revealing the pale, glistening sheen of nervous perspiration along his hairline. His fingers were actively twisting the gold band of his wristwatch, a physical manifestation of the immense pressure building behind his eyes. He knew to the exact second how much time remained before the escrow officers at Tallgrass Title executed the automated payment router, and my refusal to pick up the silver pen was actively disrupting his timeline. I left the writing instrument resting entirely untouched against the porcelain edge of my bread plate, my hands folding neatly together in my lap. The silence that followed my refusal was not passive. It was a heavy, calculated block that forced the room to adjust to my parameter change. My mother's eyes darted toward Aunt Renee, her lips compressing into a thin, pale line that signaled the immediate transition from performative warmth to defensive hostility. They had constructed their entire strategy on the absolute certainty that I would choose to avoid a public emotional scene, believing that the setting of an upscale restaurant on a Friday morning would paralyze my ability to resist their directives. They did not understand that an information security expert does not navigate an active system breach through emotional expression. I was tracking their inputs, measuring their anxiety levels, and waiting for the exact moment to deploy the terminal diagnostic data. Before my father could formulate a secondary argument to salvage his presentation, the minor friction of his financial explanation gave way to a much harsher layer of domestic conflict. Aunt Renee shifted her weight in the linen booth, her cream-colored shoulders squaring as she prepared to introduce the tribalist leverage she had used to police the family boundaries for a generation. She pulled her monogrammed portfolio closer to her chest, her manicured nails digging into the leather boundary as she looked down at me with an expression of supreme cold disappointment. She told the table that it was deeply tragic when a child allowed personal greed to override the survival of the bloodline, suggesting that my reluctance to assist my father in this moment of corporate transition was a direct insult to the memory of my grandfather Silas. She was actively attempting to rewrite the history of the lake house, converting my grandfather's sacred natural legacy into a transactional currency to bail out her brother's poor speculative decisions. They were sitting in judgment of my integrity while actively executing a multi-million-dollar land theft, entirely oblivious to the reality that their operations had been under continuous surveillance since Wednesday morning. I watched the color continue to drain from my father's cheeks as he checked his device underneath the edge of the table, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as the clock ticked closer to the 10:15 closing deadline downtown. The trap they had constructed for me was beginning to close on their own fingers, and the dramatic tension inside the empty bistro was escalating toward a total structural failure. I remained entirely motionless, my breathing level and controlled, allowing the weight of their own desperation to drive the system toward its breaking point. We are executing this maneuver for the absolute survival of our collective household. Hazel. My mother added her vocal pitch, descending into a sharp, brittle register that grated against the quiet ambiance of the restaurant as our silence stretched past 40 agonizing seconds. She braced her palms flat against the edge of the table, leaning forward until the scent of her expensive lavender perfume crossed the white linen divide. She explained that my younger brother Garrett was currently attempting to finalize his commercial financing for a boutique fitness franchise in Rogers, and this old lakefront asset was the solitary item preventing the family from unlocking their core liquidity. She told me not to be difficult, utilizing that specific tone reserved for reprimanding a stubborn child. She reminded me that I had always been the fiercely independent member of the Brooks line, suggesting that because I possessed a corporate database salary, I simply did not require the physical land the way my brother did. Aunt Renee nodded with sharp synchronized approval, leaning back against the leather cushion with an expression of casual superiority. "Blood looks after blood," Claire Renee said, before her eyes widened slightly as she caught her own verbal slip. She dismissed the error with a wave of her manicured hand, correcting herself without a single hint of shame. "Blood looks after blood, Hazel. We are obligated to shield the primary family name from public embarrassment. You are merely a single woman with a technology job in Fayetteville. What practical purpose does a massive 4-bedroom lake house on the water serve for your lifestyle anyway? It is time to abandon this emotional stubbornness and look at the broader ledger realistically." I remained entirely motionless, watching the light catch the condensation on my untouched water glass. The verbal slip from my aunt was not merely an accident, it was an ancestral blueprint. Claire Vance was the name of my father's first cousin, a woman who had inherited my grandmother's original homestead in the early 90s, only to be systematically frozen out of every single holiday gathering, family registry, and regional reunion, until she eventually surrendered the deed to my father for pennies on the dollar to escape the isolation. They were attempting to run the exact same legacy deletion script on me that they had successfully deployed against Claire 30 years ago. I sat there and watched them weaponize the precise tribalist vocabulary they had utilized to exclude me from every major vacation and domestic celebration for the past 10 years. When Garrett was given an all-expenses-paid trip to Europe after his sophomore year, my mother had explained that since I was so beautifully self-reliant, I would undoubtedly enjoy spending my summer vacation managing the overnight system migrations at the logistics firm. When the family portraits were commissioned for the country club gallery, the photographer was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon when they knew I was trapped in a mandatory security audit downtown. They had spent a decade teaching me that my connection to the Brooks name was a temporary lease, a secondary line item that could be erased the exact microsecond a corporate debt emergency required a human sacrifice. The psychological friction in the booth was shifting from a passive manipulation into an active, suffocating hostility. My mother's fingers began to tap a frantic cadence against her coffee saucer, the porcelain clicking like a countdown timer. My father's eyes remained glued to his luxury wristwatch, his skin taking on a distinct mottled gray tone under the bistro's recessed lighting. They were suffocating under the weight of their own ticking clock, knowing that the closing agents at Tallgrass Title were currently staring at an incomplete escrow file 3 blocks away. They needed my submission to validate their fraud, yet they were completely incapable of seeing that their leverage was entirely non-existent. What they failed to realize was that their long history of domestic exclusion had accidentally provided me with the ultimate defensive advantage. By cutting me out of their emotional ecosystem, they had stripped themselves of the ability to cause me genuine pain. They were appealing to a sense of family loyalty that they had never actually cultivated, demanding a sacrifice for a brother who had never once acknowledged the midnight shifts I worked to secure my own survival. I did not view the three individuals sitting across from me as my protectors or my kin. I viewed them as malicious actors attempting an unauthorized intrusion into a secure data structure that my grandfather Silas had entrusted to my custody. Aunt Renee reached across the linen cloth, her hand hovering dangerously close to my work satchel, as if she could physically extract my compliance through sheer proximity. She reminded me that if my father's development corporation went under, the social fallout would ripple across the entire county, impacting Garrett's business prospects and casting a dark shadow over our standing at the regional country club. She spoke of these social markers as if they were matters of life and death, entirely oblivious to the reality that a database administrator measures reality in verified logs, not the superficial opinions of the Fayetteville Country Club board. I leaned back slightly, allowing the distance between us to widen my posture, remaining perfectly straight and balanced. The minor conflict of their verbal assault was about to collide directly with the catastrophic structural trap I had prepared for them. I reached down into my bag, my fingers bypassing the encrypted digital drives, to rest against the cool, smooth surface of a standard manila folder. My parents watched the movement of my shoulder, a sudden flash of triumphant anticipation crossing my mother's face as she assumed I was finally reaching for the silver pen to sign away my grandfather's home. They were entirely ready to celebrate my capitulation, completely unaware that the document I was about to introduce would permanently dismantle their entire financial existence before the waiter could even return to our table. I pulled the folder into the light, the heavy paper snapping quietly as I placed it directly over the face-down waiver, changing the parameters of the room forever. I did not raise my pitch. I did not recount the exhausting nights I spent sleeping on the cold tiles of the server room floor while my brother Garrett was hosting parties in his luxury apartment. Nor did I remind them of the way they had forgotten my 25th birthday, entirely choosing instead to attend a charity golf tournament in Little Rock without sending a text message. I leaned forward slightly across the white tablecloth, my voice dropping into that ultra-calm, perfectly measured tone I reserved for high-severity enterprise system audits when a critical infrastructure failure was actively occurring. "Father," I said quietly, keeping my gaze locked directly onto his eyes, "did you file the initial property transfer paperwork through the Washington County Clerk under your personal legal name, or did you attempt to execute the entire transaction through the Legacy Estate Administration account?" Richard Brooks blinked twice, the remaining color instantly draining from his neck as his fingers tightened convulsively around the thin glass of his water tumbler. He had built his entire strategy on the absolute certainty that his quiet daughter would offer nothing more than passive resistance or tearful compliance, and he had completely failed to budget for me using the precise forensic language of regional property law. That is handled entirely by the professional closing staff at Tallgrass Title, downtown Hazel. He stammered, his usual smooth executive delivery fracturing as his eyes flicked toward my mother for immediate rhetorical support. "You do not have any operational reason to worry yourself about the underlying back-end logistics. Just apply your signature to this simple acknowledgement form right now so we can finish this civilized family breakfast and move on with our respective schedules." I allowed a faint smile to appear on my face, the first genuine expression I had exhibited since stepping into the corner booth. "I am not signing the waiver because the transaction you are currently trying to ratify has already triggered a total system override," I said, pulling the heavy manila folder from my leather satchel and placing it directly over the face-down document near my bread plate. The sound of the thick paper hitting the table was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the restaurant kitchen like a physical barrier. The minor friction of my father's defensive stuttering dissolved instantly, giving way to a much deeper, far more terrifying conflict as I opened the folder to reveal the printed metadata tracking sheets. I pointed to the top line of the forensic data log, showing the exact Internet Protocol routing address that had initiated the property listing on Monday morning. I explained that when he accessed the dormant corporate electronic signature portal from my undergraduate vehicle loan to manufacture my authorization, he had used the secure Wi-Fi network located inside the Fayetteville Country Club clubhouse, a network that automatically logs the unique media access control address of his personal luxury smartphone. My mother reached across the table, her hand shaking slightly as she tried to pull the file away from me, but I kept my palm flat against the paperwork, refusing to cede the physical territory. "This is an absolute outrage," Evelyn hissed, her polite Southern social mask completely shattering to reveal the desperate, predatory individual underneath. "You are treating your own father like a corporate criminal over a piece of inherited dirt that should have belonged to him in the first place. Your grandfather, Silas, was not in his right mind when he drafted that document, and we are simply restoring the natural balance of this family asset." I turned the page over to expose the secondary tracking sheet, which detailed the financial accounts tied to the Dallas Hospitality Syndicate's escrow deposit. I looked directly at my brother Garrett, who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. I noted that the Texas Corporation had already wired a non-refundable earnest money deposit of $240,000 into an account that had been flagged for automated fraud monitoring less than 2 hours ago. My parents had spent their lives believing that the digital world was an invisible, magical space where transactions could be hidden behind layers of corporate shell titles, completely unaware that every keystroke leaves an indelible, permanent footprint in the database registry. The dramatic intensity inside the restaurant booth escalated to a suffocating level as my father realized his entire financial survival plan was sitting exposed on a breakfast table. He looked at the digital clock on his phone, which now read 10:11, exactly 4 minutes before the title company was scheduled to release the final wire transfers to his primary commercial creditors. If those funds were blocked, the bank would proceed with the immediate foreclosure of his personal residence and the public liquidation of his development firm's remaining assets, destroying the pristine social status he had sacrificed his daughter's trust to maintain. Aunt Renee leaned into my space, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper as she attempted to deploy her final layer of emotional manipulation. "You will destroy this entire household if you do not sign that paper, Hazel," she threatened, her manicured nails digging into the edge of the wooden booth. "Your father's reputation will be completely ruined across the entire state, and your brother will lose his business funding before he even opens the doors. You are showing an absolute lack of basic human decency for the people who provided you with a roof over your head." I looked at her, my expression remaining entirely detached from her emotional theater. The roof they provided was a structural calculation, an investment they had spent the last 10 years trying to claw back through quiet neglect and administrative exclusion. I told her that decency requires a foundation of integrity, something that had been completely absent from their accounting since the day my grandfather passed away. They had treated my inheritance like a temporary line item they could simply erase from the ledger, and now they were discovering that the system architect had installed a permanent defensive firewall designed specifically to trap them in the middle of the transaction. Before my father could speak another word, a shadow fell over the table, disrupting the tight circle of our confrontation. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a charcoal wool suit stepped beside our booth, carrying a heavy leather briefcase with brass fittings that bore the unmistakable emblem of an established Hot Springs legal firm. It was Marcus Vance, his silver hair brushed back cleanly, his eyes carrying the sharp, cold intelligence of a veteran trial attorney who had spent 40 years defending the natural resources of the Ozarks from external predators. My parents froze in their seats, their mouths opening slightly, as the legal ghost of my grandfather's past materialized directly inside their secure diversion plot. The dynamic of the room shifted instantly, transitioning from a petty family extortion into a formal legal execution that none of them were prepared to survive. I opened the folder with a deliberate, steady motion, sliding 3 pristine certified pages flat onto the white tablecloth. I arranged them side by side, perfectly aligned, like a sequence of critical exhibits being introduced in a federal deposition. The first page was a formal retainer letter bearing the heavy embossed letterhead of Vance and Associates, legally confirming that I was under the active representation of independent counsel. The second page was a comprehensive encrypted digital metadata log that provided undeniable technical proof regarding the origin of the electronic signature on the Texas Syndicate's contract. It traced the transaction back to a specific Internet Protocol address registered directly to my father's home office in Bentonville, stamped at a time when my primary employee credentials showed I was logged into a secure enterprise database server 50 miles away in Fayetteville. The third page was a certified copy of Silas Brooks' original land deed, highlighted in bright yellow ink along the bottom margin where a specific structural clause had been written. My parents stared down at the documents, the silence at the table becoming so dense that the low hum of the restaurant refrigerator sounded like a distant engine. Aunt Renee's mouth opened slightly, her highly polished country club veneer fracturing to reveal a sudden, panicked confusion as she looked from the highlighted text back to my unmoving face. "What is this absolute nonsense?" Evelyn hissed, her voice rising into a sharp, erratic pitch that caused a server near the kitchen door to pause and glance toward our corner booth. "You are conducting an audit on your own parents over a family real estate matter. We raised you, Hazel. We gave you a roof over your head and provided for your needs when you had nothing." I kept both of my palms pressed flat against the edge of the table, my posture remaining perfectly balanced as I looked directly into her eyes. "You did not raise a daughter, Mother," I said softly, ensuring my tone remained completely devoid of the anger she was trying to provoke. "You simply managed what you perceived to be a depreciating asset on your household balance sheet. You minimized my costs and maximized my isolation to ensure that every available resource could be funneled into my brother's lifestyle. But your primary tactical error was forgetting that grandfather understood information security long before the internet existed." The minor friction of my mother's defensive outburst dissolved instantly, replaced by a much larger structural conflict as Marcus Vance stepped closer to the table, his heavy leather briefcase resting on the empty chair beside me. He reached down and tapped the highlighted yellow section on the third page with a silver fountain pen. He explained that my grandfather Silas had not merely relied on a standard testamentary document to protect his legacy from his son's history of commercial default. Silas Brooks had been a surveyor for the state land department in his youth, an individual who fully understood how easily a traditional property deed could be manipulated or hidden by desperate family members. During the final week of his life, while my parents were busy auditing his bank accounts and planning the liquidation of his personal assets, Silas had quietly executed a secondary restrictive covenant directly into the county land registry. This hidden administrative clause stipulated that any attempted sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the Beaver Lake property required a physical, in-person verification before a seated county judge, completely invalidating any remote or electronic authorization methods. My father's eyes locked onto the legal text, his face draining of its remaining color as the reality of his situation became clear. He had spent 2 weeks coordinating a secret cash transaction with the Texas Hospitality Syndicate, promising them a seamless, accelerated closing that would bypass standard judicial reviews. Now, with the clock reading 10:13, he was realizing that the electronic signature he had meticulously forged through the old vehicle loan portal was nothing more than a digital ghost, a completely useless entry that had failed to clear the primary security gate. The immediate conflict shifted from a private family dispute into an active legal crisis as my father's phone began to vibrate violently against his thigh. The display screen illuminated with the name of the managing escrow officer at Tallgrass Title. He did not answer it. He sat entirely paralyzed, watching the green light flash against the white cloth as he realized the closing agents had likely just scanned the county database and discovered the permanent block Silas had installed 56 months ago. The Dallas corporate syndicate would immediately withdraw their $2.4 million cash offer upon discovering a title defect of this magnitude, triggering an immediate breach of contract protocol and exposing my father's firm to an uninsurable liability. Aunt Renee reached across the table, her linen sleeves brushing against the water glasses, as she tried to gather the printed logs into her portfolio. "This cannot be legally binding," she claimed, her voice shaking with an aggressive desperation that lacked any of her previous social authority. Silas was heavily medicated during his final days at the hospital. We have the medical records to prove he lacked the capacity to alter the property structure without his primary executor's consent. This is a malicious attempt to ruin your brother's commercial future, Hazel. Marcus Vance did not move his pen from the deed. He looked down at Renee with the cold, unblinking expression of a veteran prosecutor. He informed her that he had personally witnessed the signature inside the county clerk's office, accompanied by 3 independent medical evaluations, confirming Silas's absolute cognitive clarity at the time of the filing. He stated that any attempt to challenge the validity of this covenant in an open courtroom would require a full evidentiary hearing, a process that would make my father's electronic identity fraud a matter of public record before the state licensing board. My mother sank back against the leather cushion, her hands dropping into her lap as the final remnants of her performative control disappeared. She looked at my brother Garrett, who was now holding his head in his hands, completely aware that the commercial funding for his fitness franchise had just been deleted from the schedule. They had arrived at this restaurant believing they were the predators, executing a quiet, civilized erasure of an inconvenient daughter to secure their own financial liquidity. Instead, they were discovering that they had been guided into a secure testing environment where every move they made was being systematically recorded for future deployment. The structural trap my grandfather had engineered was fully operational, and the closing sequence was about to transition into its final, irreversible phase. My father reached out his trembling hand toward the phone, finally accepting the transmission from the title company as the room waited for the system failure to become official. My father reached out his trembling hand toward his own flashing device, but before his fingers could touch the glass, my personal phone began to vibrate against the white tablecloth. The display screen illuminated with the identical incoming identification marker, Tallgrass Title and Escrow. I picked up the device with a fluid, unhurried motion, bypassed the privacy receiver, and tapped the speakerphone icon. I placed the phone down precisely in the geometric center of the table, resting it right over the face-down waiver, forcing my parents and Aunt Renee to face the auditory data payload together. The frantic, elevated voice of Sarah Jenkins, the senior closing officer at the title firm, instantly filled the quiet air of the corner booth. Mr. Brooks. Richard. Are you at this number? The corporate employee gasped completely, discarding the standard measured protocol typical of a high-value real estate transaction. We are experiencing a catastrophic structural issue with the Beaver Lake escrow file. The legal representatives for the Texas Hospitality Syndicate just issued an emergency recall notice and pulled their entire $2.4 million wire transfer from our clearing account. My father slammed both of his palms flat onto the table, rising from his seat so rapidly that the wooden legs of his chair scraped with a loud, piercing shriek against the bistro's oak floorboards. Several patrons at the front counter turned around to stare, but Richard Brooks was far too consumed by financial panic to notice his public exposure. "What do you mean they pulled the wire?" he demanded, his voice cracking into a harsh, desperate register as he leaned over the table toward my phone. "The purchase contract is fully executed. The electronic signature verification was officially cleared through the administration portal on Monday morning. The funding should be resting in my corporate account right now." Sarah Jenkins let out a ragged, exhausted breath over the speakerphone, the sound of her frantic keyboard typing audible in the background. "The digital validation token does not matter anymore, Richard," she explained, her clinical tone carrying a cold finality that cut through his desperate protest. "When our underwriting system ran the final automated index check 10 minutes ago, prior to releasing the funds, the state land registry flagged a permanent administrative title block on the parcel. A secondary unalterable deed was filed directly by your late father, Silas Brooks, during his final week of life. The system indicates you do not possess the legal capacity to sell this property, and the syndicate is threatening to file an immediate breach of contract suit against your development firm if their earnest money is not returned within the hour." The minor friction of my father's verbal denial dissolved instantly, replaced by a much larger, terrifying realization as he stood frozen above the table, his chest heaving under his tailored suit jacket. He had spent months constructing what he believed to be a flawless, invisible liquidation scheme, utilizing a dormant electronic credential from my undergraduate vehicle loan to bypass my knowledge. He had engineered this entire Dixon Street breakfast invitation to serve as a physical firewall, intending to keep me distracted and silent, while the cash from the Texas corporation was routed directly to his commercial creditors. Now the structural reality of his fraud was collapsing backward into his own network. The historical reason for his failure sat right beside me in the person of Marcus Vance. My father had spent 30 years operating under the assumption that he could outmaneuver the older generation, viewing his father Silas as a sentimental relic who valued regional heritage over raw liquidity. Richard had ignored the fact that Silas Brooks spent 4 decades serving as a chief regional land surveyor for the State Infrastructure Department, mapping the very coordinates of the Beaver Lake shoreline before my father was even born. Silas knew the exact paths of the regional legal system better than any commercial developer in the county, and he had spent his final days ensuring that his son's predatory financial habits could never compromise the sanctuary he had built with his own hands. The dramatic intensity inside the empty bistro escalated as my mother reached out her manicured fingers, hovering over my phone as if she could physically claw the voice of the title officer out of the speaker. "Sarah, this must be an index entry error," Evelyn insisted, her voice dropping into a tense, desperate whisper as she tried to salvage their position without alerting the remaining diners to their crisis. The probate court finalized the estate administration parameters months ago. We hold the primary execution rights for the residual family holdings. Check the digital ledger again. The voice on the speakerphone remained entirely unyielding. "There is no indexing error, Mrs. Brooks." Sarah Jenkins replied, her tone sharpening as she detected the underlying deception. "The document uploaded by the state registry is an absolute non-negotiable asset protection title instrument. It carries a cryptographic validation stamp from the state land commissioner's office that overrides any remote electronic submissions. According to the core registry, the legal title to the entire Beaver Lake shoreline was transferred out of the traditional family line years ago." I looked up at my father, whose hands were now shaking so violently he had to brace his knuckles against the edge of the tablecloth to remain standing. The executive confidence that had defined his identity at the country club for 2 decades had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pale, broken debtor who was staring down the barrel of an immediate corporate bankruptcy and a potential federal wire fraud investigation. He looked at my brother Garrett, who had slumped entirely forward in his seat, his eyes wide with the realization that the commercial financing for his fitness franchise had vanished into the exact same digital void that had claimed their entitlement. Aunt Renee was the first to break the paralyzing silence, her cream linen jacket rustling, as she leaned across the table toward Marcus Vance, her face distorted with an aggressive defensive fury. "This is a coordinated ambush," she hissed, abandoning the last remnants of her polite Southern social cadence. "You helped that old man manipulate the regional registry while he was confined to a hospital bed, Marcus. You knew my brother was counting on that asset to stabilize his development portfolio. This is an intentional tort, and we will have your legal license revoked by the State Bar Association before the weekend concludes." Marcus Vance did not flinch. He slowly reached down, closed his heavy leather briefcase with a crisp metallic snap of the brass latches, and looked up at Renee with an expression of calm, professional indifference. "You may file whatever administrative complaints your remaining funds will allow, Renee," the veteran attorney stated, his voice carrying the absolute weight of an unassailable legal judgment. "But your brother's immediate concern should not be my professional credentials. His immediate concern should be the fact that he just presented a forged digital instrument to an out-of-state corporate syndicate, an action that transitioned from a private family matter into a federal banking offense the exact microsecond that wire transfer was initiated on Monday morning. The system my father had trusted to protect his reputation had turned entirely hostile, leaving him trapped inside a closing sequence that was now rendering his total ruin in real time." The dining area of the bistro fell into an absolute suffocating silence, the only audible sound being the low, rhythmic hum of the building's air conditioning system vibrating through the floorboards. I watched my father sink backward into his chair, his tall frame suddenly appearing diminished, his complexion shifting into an ash-gray shade that signaled the total collapse of his executive confidence. The legal architecture he had spent 30 years trying to maneuver around was finally closing in, exposing the fragility of his speculative empire. On the still active speakerphone resting in the center of the table, the voice of Sarah Jenkins continued to read the granular details from the newly unsealed county record. The document is an automatic transfer on death deed, paired with an explicit non-alienation covenant. Jenkins explained, her voice remaining clinical and detached, entirely focused on the technical requirements of the registry. Silas Brooks legally transferred the entire Lake estate into an unalterable asset protection trust administered solely by Hazel Alexandra Brooks, effective immediately upon the date of his passing. Furthermore, the covenant explicitly stipulates that any attempt by secondary family members to list, lease, or encumber the property instantly triggers a total forfeiture of their adjacent residential inheritance on Linden Road. The house is not yours to sell, Richard. It never was. I looked directly at my mother, whose hands were shaking with such force that she inadvertently dropped her heavy silver pen onto the floor, the metal clicking sharply against the hardwood. The revelation was not just a legal correction, it was a total reconfiguration of their reality. Silas had not just left me a quiet cabin on the water. He had essentially transformed the entire family landholding into a complex legal landmine intentionally buried in the registry, waiting for my parents to step on it the moment they attempted to bypass my authority. My father had spent 2 decades treating my grandfather like an aging, sentimental obstacle to his own commercial development ambitions, completely underestimating the calculated defensive foresight Silas had employed to safeguard the land from a serial defaulter. The minor tension of the title officer's announcement gave way to a much larger, more volatile domestic conflict, as my mother began to realize the implications of the non-alienation covenant. The residential property on Linden Road was the crown jewel of our family social status, a sprawling estate that had hosted dozens of high society fundraisers and political dinners over the years. It was the physical headquarters of my parents' standing in the Fayetteville elite, and the instrument Silas had filed meant that if they did not immediately cease their fraudulent efforts to liquidate the lake property, they would simultaneously forfeit their primary residence. My mother's eyes darted toward my father, a silent, mounting rage building, as she understood the sheer scale of the financial hole he had dug for them. He had not only failed to secure the $2.4 million in cash from the Texas syndicate, he had actively put their current home on the line through his poorly executed title fraud. I sat there observing the disintegration of their cohesion with the same cold, detached curiosity I applied to a server crash. My parents had spent my entire adolescence forcing me into a role of quiet compliance, demanding I sacrifice my own development opportunities so that the household assets could be protected and expanded for the sake of the family brand. They viewed my existence as a resource to be managed, a secondary index that could be pruned or edited whenever the broader database required a boost in liquidity. Now, they were trapped inside a logic gate of their own construction, where every move they made to save their reputation only accelerated the process of their ruin. They had never considered the possibility that the quiet daughter they ignored would one day be the person holding the primary administrative password to their entire existence. Aunt Renee leaned across the table, her face now a mask of pure, unadulterated malice, her previous social performance entirely discarded. "You orchestrated this from the start," she spat, her finger pointing accusingly at my chest. "You waited for your grandfather to get weak, and you used your little technology degrees to manipulate him into signing away the family wealth before he was even cold. This is nothing but a calculated, spiteful act of professional theft, and you are going to regret the day you decided to turn your own blood into an enemy." She was attempting to project her own predatory behavior onto my actions, desperate to reclaim the moral high ground that had been stripped away by the reality of the public registry. I looked at her, my posture remaining perfectly still. I did not need to offer a defense against her accusations because the facts contained in the county registry were self-authenticating. My grandfather had trusted me because I was the only person in the Brooks line who prioritized the integrity of the architecture over the immediate gain of the liquidation. He knew that if he left the property to Richard, it would be sold to the highest bidder the following morning. He gave it to me because he knew I would treat the land as a permanent archive, not a transactional asset. I was not the person stealing the heritage. I was the person maintaining the server logs that had exposed their attempted hack. The drama escalated further as my father finally placed the phone against his ear, his voice trembling as he attempted to negotiate with the title company, only to be met with a flat final denial. The Texas syndicate had already initiated a formal investigation request with the State Banking Commission, triggering a mandatory review of all related transactions associated with my father's development firm. His attempt to secure an emergency cash flow had instead triggered a comprehensive forensic audit that would likely result in the freezing of every single account he currently controlled. He sat back down the phone, slipping from his hand onto the table, his eyes staring blankly at the wall as he realized the system had performed exactly as Silas had designed. My brother Garrett began to speak, his voice thin and cracking, asking my father what this meant for his franchise investment, his tone suggesting he was only just beginning to comprehend the reality of their insolvency. My mother cut him off with a harsh, silencing gesture, her attention entirely locked onto me, her expression a mix of terrified desperation and mounting fury. She realized that I held the only key to the Asset Protection Trust, and that unless I chose to cooperate, they were staring at an immediate public and total social erasure. The table was no longer a breakfast meeting. It was the final inspection of a doomed structural configuration, and I was the only one in the room who possessed the master access codes to the remaining system components. That was the exact moment Evelyn Brooks finally surrendered, the one thing she had spent 3 decades meticulously curating, her perfectly manicured public composure. She rose from the booth with a sudden, violent grace, her face contorted into a jagged mixture of deep financial terror and unadulterated raw rage. Her voice did not just carry. It rang out across the quiet, upscale dining room like a shattered glass, drawing the immediate attention of every patron in the bistro. After every single investment we made in your future, she screamed, her hands slamming down onto the tabletop with such force that the heavy wine glasses vibrated against the silver cutlery, causing one to tip and shatter into a fine, sparkling dust of crystal. After all the decades we spent fighting to keep this family name respectable in the eyes of this community, you choose to do this to us. You choose to humiliate your father and me in a public space over an old rotting piece of dirt. You ungrateful, cold-blooded bitch. The sudden outburst triggered an immediate silence across the restaurant. The ambient chatter of the breakfast rush vanished, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable tension. Waiters froze in place, their hands hovering over trays of hot coffee, their eyes darting between the scene at the corner booth and their manager, who was watching from the doorway. My mother did not care who was listening. The mask of the elite corporate matriarch had been stripped away, revealing the volatile, desperate woman who existed beneath the surface of the country club galas and the tailored clothing. She had spent my entire life teaching me that social presentation was the absolute metric of success, and now she was shattering that very standard in front of a room full of strangers. Aunt Renee was frantically pulling at the hem of Evelyn's sleeve, her movements jerky and panicked as she hissed under her breath, "Evelyn, please sit down immediately. Everybody in the room is looking at us. Stop this behavior right now." But the script was entirely gone, incinerated by the sudden realization that their financial existence was being dismantled. All Evelyn had left was the raw transactional truth coming out in a disjointed, screaming, sideways flow. She was shouting about their lost status, about the shame of the impending bankruptcy, and the utter betrayal of having a daughter who would not sacrifice her own inheritance to pad their failing bottom line. It was a brilliant, tragic demonstration of the reality I had lived with my entire life, proving to every single observer in the room that genuine love had never been part of their emotional inventory, only the acquisition and management of assets. I remained seated at the table, my posture entirely unaffected by her display. I held my water glass with a perfectly steady hand, watching the remnants of their social standing disintegrate in real time. The conflict had shifted from a private legal matter to a public social catastrophe for the Brooks family. The other diners who had arrived for a quiet morning meal were now witnessing the unvarnished reality of the people they had regarded as regional titans. My father was staring at his wife, his mouth slightly agape, clearly paralyzed by the fact that the secret of their insolvency was now being broadcast to the very community members whose opinions he had sacrificed everything to preserve. Garrett was physically cowering in his seat, shielding his face with his hands, as if he could physically hide from the social consequences of his mother's breakdown. The waiter who had been stationed at our booth turned and walked toward the kitchen, clearly intending to alert the manager that the police might need to be summoned to handle the escalating disturbance. This was the logical conclusion to the way they had operated for years, valuing the image of the household over the internal integrity of the people living inside it. They had built a shell of success that lacked a central core, and now the entire structure was buckling under the weight of its own emptiness. I looked at my mother, who was now weeping with a frustrated, jagged intensity, her mascara streaking down her cheeks as she continued to berate the empty air. She was furious not because I was wrong, but because I had denied her the ability to control the narrative of our family history. She wanted me to go quietly into the background to accept my status as the discarded independent daughter so that she could continue playing the role of the successful honored matriarch. By refusing to comply, I had forced her to confront the reality of her own choices, and she was responding with the only tool she had left: uncontrolled destructive fury. The weight of the moment felt immense, a culmination of all the small slights, the forgotten birthdays, the deliberate exclusions, and the systematic erosion of my place in the family unit. Everything they had ever said about family duty and blood ties was being exposed as a collection of empty, opportunistic slogans meant to maintain their absolute control over our lives. They did not care about the heritage of the lake house, nor did they care about the history of my grandfather's work. They only cared about the price tag attached to the shoreline and the fact that they were losing access to the capital, needed to maintain their superficial social standing. A new conflict began to manifest in the shadows of her, screaming the arrival of the restaurant manager, who was pushing through the tables with a look of stern professional concern. He was moving toward us to demand that the disturbance be terminated, or that our party be escorted out of the building. This was the final inevitable outcome of their strategy, a total loss of their public domain. My father realized that the manager was approaching and finally made a move to stand, his eyes flashing with a desperate hope that he could still manage the optics of the situation. He tried to reach for his wife's arm to pull her back into the booth, but she recoiled, the spectacle now having moved beyond his ability to regulate it. I set my glass down on the table, the soft clink of the crystal sounding like a final decisive note in the middle of a symphony of chaos. I had achieved the exact scenario that Silas had predicted: a total public exposure of their internal corruption. The trap was not just legal, it was social, and it was now operating at a level they could no longer navigate. The look on the manager's face as he reached our booth was the final indicator that the Dixon Street Bistro would no longer be the neutral territory they had chosen for their closing ceremony. I watched my father's expression, the slow, agonizing transition from denial to the acceptance that the damage to his reputation was already irreversible. The scene was perfectly set for the final terminal exit I had been planning since I first logged into the county registry. I stood up slowly, my movements unhurried and precise, the tension in the booth vibrating around me like the hum of a static charged circuit. I pulled my manila folder against my chest, the hard edges of the certified documents providing a physical anchor against the turbulent atmosphere of the dining room. I looked down at them one last time. My mother was breathing in jagged, wet gulps, her face blotched with the physical evidence of her uncontrolled outburst, while my father had his head buried in his hands, his posture indicating the total collapse of his executive confidence. The reality of his impending financial ruin was no longer a theoretical risk. It was an active reality that would define the rest of his existence. "You told me earlier today that blood looks after blood," I said, my voice remaining low, carrying a clean, devastating clarity that pierced through the remnants of my mother's fading, shrill rage. "But grandfather taught me that a genuine family structure does not require a signature forgery or predatory liquidations to survive. You kept me around for 28 years as a low-overhead utility, a convenient variable you could ignore whenever the main processing load became too demanding. Today, that entire operational system is officially offline." I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not order breakfast. I did not demand a performative apology for the decades of exclusion, and I certainly did not offer a dramatic exit line intended to solicit their final sympathy. I simply turned my back on the corner booth, the site of their planned financial execution, and began to walk across the polished floor of the bistro. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the screaming that had filled the air moments earlier. The patrons who had been watching the spectacle now averted their eyes, seemingly embarrassed to have witnessed the internal decay of a family that had once projected an image of regional prominence. I walked past the hostess who was standing at the entrance with her hands pressed against the podium, her expression a mix of professional shock and relief that the scene was finally ending. Stepping through the glass door and out into the bright, clean Arkansas sunshine felt like a total environmental shift. The heat was still present, but the suffocating stale air of the internal restaurant conflict was replaced by the open circulating breeze of the morning. I kept my pace steady, moving toward my vehicle parked in the lot across the street. I did not look back a single time. I did not need to see the way they sat in the booth, staring at the empty space I had occupied, finally beginning to compute the true scope of the legal trap that Silas had constructed for them. The boundary I had established was complete, and the distance between my life and theirs was now absolute. As I reached my sedan, the calm efficiency of my mental state allowed me to begin the final phase of the operation. I opened my digital dashboard and accessed the secure portal Marcus Vance had established for the Asset Protection Trust. With a few precise inputs, I executed the final terminal command. The automatic alert was sent to the State Banking Commission, providing them with the full forensic package, documenting my father's attempted identity fraud, and the non-authorized use of the corporate signature portal. There was no room left for his attorneys to file procedural delays. The evidence was already in the hands of the investigative regulators. My father's development corporation would be effectively frozen within the hour, preventing him from diverting any secondary assets to cover his mounting commercial liabilities. The minor conflict of the bistro exit gave way to a wider systemic resolution as I started the ignition. I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was not anticipating a text message from my mother about family obligations or a phone call from my father regarding some financial favor he required. The silence I was driving away from was not an absence. It was the creation of a clean, protected space. I merged into the morning traffic on the highway, my route directed toward the Cedar Log House on the northern shore of Beaver Lake. The property was finally secure, the title protected by an ironclad covenant that would remain in effect long after the current social drama had faded into local memory. I thought about my grandfather Silas, the way he would spend his afternoons sitting on the dock, watching the water levels rise and fall with the shifting seasons. He had been a man who understood that power is not measured by the accumulation of speculative real estate, but by the ability to safeguard the few things that actually matter against the currents of greed. He had seen his son's character, clearly recognizing that a person who treats family like a commodity will eventually attempt to monetize the very foundations of their own home. By building the Asset Protection Trust and filing the restrictive covenants in his final days, he had essentially provided me with the ultimate tool to maintain my own autonomy. The drive was quiet, the radio left off to preserve the sense of absolute clarity that had settled over me after the confrontation. My mind was already transitioning toward the future, mapping out the administrative maintenance required to manage the property and the legal notifications I would need to send to the Dallas Hospitality Syndicate to finalize the termination of their interest. There was a specific, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the forensic logs were already working, that the system was correcting the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. I was not just protecting a shoreline, I was validating the entire integrity of the lineage Silas had attempted to build. As the familiar landmarks of the lake road began to appear, the winding turns through the dense pine forest, the limestone outcrops that Silas had taught me to identify when I was just a child, I felt a profound shift in my perception of the world. I was no longer the quiet daughter waiting for permission to exist within the family registry. I was the administrator of the estate, the person who held the master key to the sanctuary, and the only person capable of determining who would be allowed to enter its boundaries. The years of feeling like an external line item in my own family were over. I was finally operating at the core level, and the system was functioning in perfect, uncorrupted alignment. I rounded the final corner toward the lake house, the water appearing like a sheet of deep cobalt glass beneath the morning sky, and I knew that the security of this location would never be compromised again. The peace of the landscape was not just a scenic view, it was an encrypted reality, a place where the noise of the outside world simply could not reach. I slowed the car as I pulled into the gravel drive, the sound of the tires crunching against the rock, the only interruption to the stillness of the heritage Silas had entrusted to my hand. 6 months after the morning at the bistro, the humidity of the Arkansas summer had finally broken, leaving behind the crisp, cooling air of an early winter evening. I sat on the wide cedar porch of the Beaver Lake house, the wood smooth and weathered beneath my touch, watching the sun dip in a brilliant cascade of orange and violet beneath the jagged Ozark ridgeline. The transformation of my environment was total. Every technical requirement of the Asset Protection Trust had executed with the exact ruthless efficiency I had programmed into the forensic audit. The secondary accounts my parents had been siphoning to fund their lifestyle of country club galas and high-density speculative developments were permanently frozen the exact second I turned 28. That singular administrative event triggered a cascade of forced liquidations across their entire portfolio, stripping away the luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the sprawling estate on Linden Road. They were currently residing in a small rented townhouse on the edge of North Little Rock, a space that existed entirely outside the social tier they had spent their lives frantically trying to maintain. The silence that had followed the events of that Friday morning was not just a lack of noise. It was an active protective barrier I had configured into my digital life. They had not attempted to contact me since the day I walked out of the Dixon Street Bistro, their pride preventing them from reaching out to a person they still viewed as an apostate. I had ensured that their numbers were permanently routed to a null directory within my personal network, guaranteeing that their attempts at guilt-tripping or last-minute bargaining would never even register on my device. This was the only way to preserve the operational peace I had worked so hard to secure. The family registry had been purged of its corrupted inputs, and for the first time, my daily routine functioned without the presence of the parasitic variables that had defined my youth. Beside me on the weathered outdoor table sat a fresh chocolate cake, the surface dark and rich under the dying light of the sun. It was crowned with a single steady candle that burned with a bright, unwavering flame. This was not a sweating, mass-produced grocery store afterthought picked up in a moment of panicked obligation. It was a genuine gesture provided by Marcus Vance and the tight-knit community of lakefront neighbors who had known my grandfather Silas for decades, people who recognized that the heritage of this shoreline was safe only in the hands of someone who understood its true value. Watching that small flame flicker, I felt a deep, resonant sense of alignment. I had spent 28 years trying to compress myself, attempting to become small enough to fit into a family ledger that was fundamentally broken, a document where my presence was recorded only as a liability to be minimized. The architecture of my life was finally optimized. The forensic logs in my corporate database at the logistics firm were operating at peak efficiency, and the land management protocols for the estate were running without a single error. I thought back to the girl who used to sleep on the bus between the graveyard shift at the server repository and her morning calculus exams, believing that if she simply worked hard enough and demanded nothing, she would eventually earn a permanent place at her parents' dinner table. I realize now that the table they offered was never a place of belonging. It was a staging ground for the next extraction. They did not value me as a person. They valued the convenience of my compliance. By choosing to reset the system, I had not only saved my grandfather's sanctuary, I had recovered my own identity from the administrative wreckage of their design. A soft breeze drifted up from the water carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth, the natural perfume of a place that did not require a subscription to a country club to validate its worth. I realized that my data was finally clean. The noise that had obscured the signal for nearly 3 decades was gone, leaving behind only the clear, reliable architecture of a life built on my own terms. I reached forward, hovering my hand over the candle, and felt the faint warmth of the flame against my skin. It was a heat that did not burn, unlike the volatile, scorching rage that had defined my mother's final display at the bistro. It was the warmth of a life allowed to flourish in a secure environment. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, centering my focus on the physical reality of the porch, the steady rhythm of the lake water lapping against the timber of the dock, and the quiet endurance of the cedar trees that Silas had planted during the summer of his return from the service. He had built this place to be a witness, a silent observer of the family story, and he had intended for me to carry the weight of its narrative forward. The twist that the rest of the family had failed to see was that Silas had never viewed me as an heir to a fortune. He had viewed me as the only person capable of being an architect of my own destiny. The inheritance was not the lake. It was the capacity to distinguish between an asset and an obligation. I blew out the candle, the plume of thin gray smoke rising into the cooling air and disappearing into the vastness of the evening sky. The single flame vanished, but the darkness that followed did not feel like an absence. It felt like a blank page ready for a new set of entries. I looked out over the expanse of Beaver Lake, the dark water reflecting the first few stars that were beginning to emerge in the twilight. The system was secure. The maintenance protocols were initialized. I had finally inherited a table where I was wanted, not because of the convenience I provided, but because of the person I had become while they were busy trying to delete me from the record. My professional life had taken a significant trajectory upward as well. With the forensic evidence of the title fraud finalized by the State Banking Commission, my firm had promoted me to a senior lead position within our enterprise logistics division, granting me the autonomy to design the next generation of our secure data processing networks. I had the resources to manage the estate, the intellectual clarity to handle the professional challenges, and the emotional space to build a community based on mutual respect rather than transactional exploitation. I stood up from the porch chair, the wood creaking softly under my weight, and walked toward the railing. I could see the lights of a distant boat moving slowly across the center of the lake, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the darkness. Everything about the environment felt correct, balanced, and perfectly indexed. The corrupted files of my previous life were locked behind a permanent wall, the encryption keys held securely in my possession. There would be no more attempts to negotiate with my parents, no more explanations provided to Aunt Renee, and no more justifications of my existence to people who had never truly seen me. The transition from the old fractured architecture to this new stable configuration was complete. I felt the cool weight of the brass boat cleat resting in my pocket, a tactile reminder of the foundations Silas had laid long before I was born. I turned back to look at the house, the warm, golden light spilling from the windows onto the porch, inviting me back inside to the quiet, organized comfort of a home that was finally and truly my own. I did not need the validation of a registry anymore, because the validation was already there in the structure of the house, the stability of the shoreline, and the unshakable confidence that I would never again be used to balance someone else's broken books. I walked through the door and into the warmth, the heavy oak entrance latch clicking securely behind me, locking the quiet, verified reality of my new life into place for the night. The silence following a story like Hazel Brooks's is not merely the absence of sound. It is a heavy, resonant space where we are forced to confront the architecture of our own lives. When I first traced the trajectory of Hazel's journey from the daughter who was expected to be easy and cheap to the woman who eventually dismantled her parents' fraudulent world, I felt the familiar sharp pang of recognition. We often think of family as a sanctuary, a place where the rules of the outside world dissolve into an unconditional embrace. Yet in our modern American landscape, where success is frequently measured by liquidity and status, the home can too easily transform into a strategic battlefield. Hazel's story is a mirror. For parents navigating the complexities of raising children in a culture that champions rugged individualism while simultaneously clinging to traditional structures of hierarchy, her struggle offers a brutal, necessary lesson. It asks us a fundamental question that few dare to voice. Do we love our children for who they are, or for the functions they perform in our own lives? Consider the parents in this narrative. They operated under a transactional code, viewing their daughter not as a human being with a distinct spirit, but as an asset to be managed, a depreciating item on a balance sheet to be liquidated when the market or their poor financial decisions demanded it. In the American dream, we are taught to provide, to build a legacy, to set our children up for the future. But what happens when that legacy is actually a cage? When we manipulate our children into believing that their value is tied to their compliance, we are not raising them. We are grooming them for a future of resentment. True parenting, in its most traditional and noble sense, is an act of release. It is the steady, patient work of equipping a child with a moral compass so that eventually they can navigate a world we may no longer be a part of. The contrast between Hazel's father Richard and her grandfather Silas is the heartbeat of this lesson. Richard saw the family estate as a consumable resource, a way to maintain a facade of respectability at the local country club. Silas conversely saw the estate as a foundation, a tool to ensure that his granddaughter would have the autonomy to remain untainted by the very greed that consumed her own parents. This brings us to the importance of honesty and fairness. We often assume that children are oblivious to the unspoken motives of their parents. We think that by shielding them from our financial anxieties or pretending to be closer than we actually are, we are protecting them. We are not. Children are exquisite observers. They can feel the difference between an embrace given out of love and one given out of expectation. When we use our children as pawns in our social games, or worse, as sources of leverage for our own failures, we teach them that love is conditional. We teach them that family responsibility is just a synonym for self-sacrifice. That is not a lesson, that is a betrayal. In our traditional upbringing, we are taught that children owe their parents everything. But the story of Hazel teaches us that honor is a reciprocal exchange. If we want our children to respect us, we must first demonstrate that we respect them as independent entities. Fairness is the bedrock of this respect. When we show favoritism, when we exploit the strength of one child to subsidize the failure of another, we create deep structural fractures that will eventually break the foundation of the family. If you treat your child as a project to be completed rather than a person to be known, do not be surprised when they eventually build a wall to protect themselves from you. Emotional awareness is the final missing piece of the puzzle. Being a parent today means more than just providing a roof and an education. It means being the guardian of a child's inner life. It means having the humility to admit when we are wrong, the vulnerability to ask for forgiveness, and the courage to set boundaries that allow our children to flourish, even if that flourishing happens away from us. It is the ability to look at your child and see someone you are proud to know, not someone you need to control. If you find yourself questioning the dynamics within your own home, if you have ever felt that the silence at your dinner table is hiding a deeper unspoken tension, know that you are not alone. These stories are not just entertainment. They are windows into our own hidden behaviors. They force us to ask whether we are building a legacy of integrity or a monument to our own insecurities. If this narrative resonated with you, if it made you think about the choices you are making or the ways you hope to shape the future of those you love, I invite you to explore more of these reflections. Follow the channel Still Drama Stories. There we dive deep into the complexities of human relationships, the shadows of the American experience, and the lessons that lie beneath the surface of the stories we tell ourselves. We are all, in a sense, like Hazel. We are all living within a structure that we did not choose, holding keys to a future we are still trying to unlock. Perhaps the most uncomfortable part of her story is not the betrayal by her parents, but the realization that we all have the power to stop the cycle. We have the power to reset the architecture of our own families. But as the sun sets on another day, one has to wonder, if you were to look at the ledger of your own life at the end of all the years and all the struggles, would you find that you spent your time building a sanctuary or a battlefield? And if you stopped the performance today, if you peeled back the layers of duty and expectation, who exactly would you be to those you claim to love? The choice is always there, waiting in the silence. The question is whether we are brave enough to make it.